Apologies to anyone who was here last year and saw me give a very similar talk, but progress reports and planning can be helpful. The idea here is it's been a whole year since the last time we got together. I know there are some new people in the room. There are some people I know well in the room. But I just wanted to go over what the VuFind project has been up to and also put out some ideas, since one of the goals of this summit is to do road mapping and figure out what we should be doing next. And there are a lot of things we could be working on. And as I say, some of these you've seen before because I talked about them as possibilities last year. They're still on the map. So let's think about things and come up with some priorities. And maybe we can even work on some of these things during hacking time. But at the same time, while I'm going to go quite in depth right now, anyone here who's new and has questions about the project more generally, I also hope to make myself available to you to answer questions and get you in, because the best thing about this is having an active community where we're all working together on these sorts of things. So 2016, what's new? We've had 2 releases since the last summit, 3.0 and 3.1. And these have done quite a few nice things. First of all, we've updated some of our most fundamental dependencies. We've gotten up to Solr 5.5, which is really groundbreaking progress in my mind, because there have been some long-standing bugs in Solr that have prevented us from accomplishing things. And they are all now finally fixed. And so Solr and VuFind are at their maximum combined potential, finally. We also very recently in the 3.1 release updated to SolarMark 3.0, which is blazingly fast and adds some great new features, which Bob is going to tell us about later, so I won't spoil any of that. We've also added a few significant new features to the core project. We now have deep facet exploration. From the very beginning, the facets in VuFind have been limited to 30 or so in each grouping in the sidebar, but now you can open up a pop-up window and go as deep as you like and sort them different ways. We've also added a local record cache, which is useful in combination with some of the APIs we support, so that when users add records to their favorites, we can actually locally clone those records into the database. So if the API goes offline or deletes records or IDs change, there's some continuity of data. And of course, we put the asterisk next to that, make sure that's in compliance with your terms of service before you turn it on for any particular service, but it's now an option that's available where appropriate. We've added an asset pipeline so that rather than serving up half a dozen or more JavaScript files on every page to account for different contingencies, VuFind can now combine those all together into a single file and serve it up for faster HTTP responses. And we've also created an embedded record feature, which if you turn it on and a user is doing searches, they never actually have to leave the search results to see detailed information about the records. It loads dynamically in place into the search results, and they can browse through it. A lot of these things are turned off by default because not everyone is going to want them. But they're new options that could improve your user experience and your performance, so be aware of them and try them out. We've also made some significant improvements to existing functionality. We spent a lot of time on improving author indexing. So previously, VuFind's author model was very much locked into sort of an outmoded MARC-based idea that every record needs to have exactly one primary author and everyone else is secondary, and that's that. And we've added support for examining MARC relator codes to figure out what types of contributors are involved in records. We now allow more than one primary author for those cases where that's appropriate, and we offer a lot of control at index time over how relators are used to assign authors to different categories. So we now have primary, secondary, and corporate authors all sort of treated as equal citizens in the system. We've greatly improved our support for geographic searching, thanks to Leela, who will be telling us more about that, so I won't go into depth there. We've continued to improve our combined search module, which allows bento box style searching in VuFind. it's now possible to do more detailed filtering in there so that you can actually create multiple bento boxes from a single index if you want to highlight different facets of the same collection. We've also put a lot of time into improving and rewriting the JavaScript parts of VuFind, particularly the code that manages pop-up light boxes, just to reduce redundant logic, make things more logical and streamlined, and make it easier to extend. Finally, and this relates to what I was saying earlier about Solar 5.5 finally fixing a bunch of outstanding bugs. We've made the extended Dismax search handler in Solar the primary search operation for VuFind. For many years, we've had to work around the fact that Dismax searching gives us better results, but the Dismax handler doesn't support common operators that people in libraries like and or and not. And so we had convoluted logic that said, use Dismax if you can, but if there's complicated syntax in your search, fail over to the leucine-based syntax and construct this giant, monstrous, complicated query that kind of gets you what you want but isn't 100% there. All of that is still there in case you want it, but we don't need to rely on it as heavily, and searches are now a lot more consistent even when advanced syntax is being used. So I'm very happy about all of that. Finally, what's new in terms of the development tools we're using as a community? I said this last year, but it's worth repeating. We've been growing more and more reliant on GitHub because it offers great features for collaborating and keeping track of projects. So we've, for example, started tagging our pull requests and putting in milestones, which is helping us organize our development work moving forward. We still have Jira, we still use Jira, but this used to be a project that centered around Jira, and now it is a project that centers around GitHub and also has Jira. We've grown more reliant on Composer, the PHP dependency management tool, for bringing in third-party dependencies and managing our tools. One of the things we talked about at last year's summit was whether we should stop bundling our dependencies in GitHub and just rely on Composer. We decided the answer was yes. That's how everybody's doing it now. We've been doing that. It doesn't seem to have caused any problems for anyone. We've also more recently included more development dependencies in our Composer configuration so that a lot of the tools we rely on for continuous integration are handled by Composer. So things like PHP unit, PHP doc, and so on, which again just reduces the complexity in getting a development setup for VuFind running and makes things more consistent, getting away from problems we've run into where somebody releases a new version of a tool and the Travis build gets that new version and suddenly something unexpectedly breaks. Composer gives us control over what versions of everything we're using and puts upgrades in our hands rather than in the hands of fate. Another thing we talked about last year was semantic versioning and the fact that we stuck with VuFind 2 for a long time to differentiate the major rewrite in VuFind 2 from the original VuFind 1 code, but it was starting to become misleading because there were a lot of backward compatibility breaks between minor versions of VuFind 2, so we decided to go forward and bump those versions more rapidly to reflect changes. So that's why VuFind 3, even though it's not nearly as dramatic a change as 1 to 2 was. But in parallel with bumping that version number, I decided to significantly reorganize the wiki documentation so that there was less explicit naming of VuFind 2 as a specific thing versus VuFind 1, while still retaining all of the legacy documentation because there are still a number of people out there running VuFind 1 who might need to look up things related to it. Though I really wish they'd upgrade. Please, upgrade. Finally, we've made great progress on our test suite by writing a lot of automated browser tests using Mink so that we now have automated testing of the user interface for most of the major important functions of VuFind, which was something that has just been hard to do, and so we've probably been too slow to get to it. But a lot of the refactoring we did over the last year required robust testing, so we finally bit the bullet and did it. And it has really paid off because we now have a way of catching problems that we would otherwise miss. So there's still room to continue improving our tests, but they're much stronger than they've ever been. And I feel more confident about certain kinds of refactoring that used to terrify me. So that's what's new. So what's next? A few themes I'd like to talk about. Continuing the trend of modularizing the code more, looking into creating API access to the VuFind functionality, continuing to move forward and keep up with our dependencies, continuing to restructure the project just generally to improve the code, thinking about getting rid of some things that we don't need that are causing a maintenance burden unnecessarily, and finally, talking about an institutional home to keep the project vibrant in the extreme long term. So I'll go into more detail on all of those, but that's the overview. So modularization. This came up last year at the summit, and it remains a valid criticism that VuFind as a project is a giant monolithic thing. I mean, internally, I think it's quite modular and it's well structured, but when you get the project, you get everything. And there are certainly some pieces in there that might be useful in other contexts rather than just as part of the monolithic VuFind project. So last year, one small but significant step forward in this is that VuFind included a tool for harvesting metadata using OAI PMH, which is really useful for VuFind, but is also not in any way VuFind specific. It just is an implementation of the protocol that downloads files to a folder and gives you lots of configuration options. So I spent some time moving that to a separate project so other people can use it, and it's now just bundled into VuFind using Composer. Doing that also allowed me to refactor the code from what was one miles-long class into a number of interoperating classes that are easily testable and easily understandable. So that was a great step forward, but it was also very obvious low-hanging fruit because its distinct nature was very clear. I think there are probably some other opportunities for doing similar kinds of refactoring, but they may not be as obvious as that. So I think we should continue to think about what parts of VuFind might be useful in other contexts and might be easily separable from the core, and continue this sort of chunking out where appropriate. I know one thing that's been talked about there is possibly moving our ILS integration tools to a separate project so that people could access ILSs programmatically outside of VuFind. I think there's something to be said for that idea. So APIs. This is a really common request. People say, I love VuFind. I want to be able to programmatically manipulate the things in there. How do I do that? And because VuFind is designed to be a fairly generalized abstraction, this is a challenging thing to do well. But there's been a lot of talk and some work on this, and a pull request was submitted late last week that looks very promising to me, and you're going to hear more about all of this in Ares talk this afternoon. So again, I will say no more right this second. So dependency updates. VuFind has been running on Zen Framework 2 for quite some time. There's now Zen Framework 3. Again, like VuFind 2 and 3, this isn't a huge shocking change, but it is significant. First of all, it bumps up the PHP requirements. Right now, VuFind requires PHP 5.4, but moving forward with Zen Framework requires us to bump that up. It's not a bad thing to keep up with dependencies, especially when PHP version support has been discontinued for things. But at the same time, I realize that in reality, some common Linux distributions are way behind, so this can be a challenge for people. But it's one that I think we'll just have to deal with. So Zen Framework 3 is more component-oriented. You know, as I say, with VuFind, we need to think about breaking up the monolith, and that's exactly what Zen Framework community did. Zen Framework 2, you got a giant bundle of everything. Zen Framework 3, it's all been packaged out. You can still get the whole bundle, but you can also pick and choose parts. And so that will allow us to tighten up VuFind a little bit by only pulling in the parts of the framework we need. It will give us more freedom to choose alternate components for certain tasks if what Zen Framework offers isn't the best option around. But I've also seen, it seems that some of these components get more attention than others. So we may also have to find some replacements for some things that have gotten neglected. In any case, I've been largely in a holding pattern on the Zen Framework updating because I need to get PHP updated on all of my own servers. But I'm hoping in the coming year there will be more time to devote to all of that. Also, we're up to Solar 6 now. From initial experiments, I don't think Solar 6 is going to be a shocking change from Solar 5. But again, dependency updates. Solar 6 now requires Java 8. Currently, VuFind requires Java 7. Again, progress is not a bad thing, but it can offer challenges, so something we need to be aware of. In terms of project restructuring, there are lots of opportunities. I just copied this slide from last year because I didn't get around to thinking about it further, but right now VuFind has some weird custom routing code for how we do our command line scripts, and I think we probably can eliminate that at the cost of changing the command line interface to a handful of utilities. So as we go forward into a major version where backward compatibility changes are acceptable, it's again something worth considering in the interest of cleaning up the code. Places where there might be opportunities for a little bit of redesign. We have lots of configuration files. Some of them are huge. Do we want to consider rearranging or splitting any of them? Our ILS driver interface has grown organically for many years. It has a lot of functionality supported, but it may not be the most efficient way to support all that functionality. We can consider making adjustments there. Sort of the core mechanism for performing searches in VuFind is currently this nesting doll thing of an options object wrapped in a parameters object, wrapped in a results object, which has been working reasonably well for us since we implemented it in VuFind 2.0, and it was a refactoring of an earlier, uglier monolithic monster. So I defend it as a step in the right direction. But it also has seemed to me one of the more unwieldy parts of the code base, and I'd love to think of better approaches. I know in the PHP community there's been a lot of talk about PSR 7, which is a standard for messaging interfaces. And this has led to a style of programming where you create a pipeline of classes that operate on an object and pass it down the line. And I sort of wonder if that kind of a model might be an improvement over what we currently have. But again, I haven't thought about it in great depth. That's just a gut feeling. But that's another area where if we want to devote some time to trying to clean up the code, we could do some experiments and think about things. Again, last year I talked about the class hierarchy for record drivers, which is currently pragmatically designed, but maybe not as logically designed as it could be. We might want to revisit some of that. Language files come up a lot. There's some stuff there that could be cleaned up for more reliable internationalization. We just need an invested international partner to help us with that because it's not a local need here, so it's hard to justify putting huge amounts of time into. We have a new permission system, which allows configuration of how people can access various parts of the application. I think there's opportunities to continue to use that in more places and more robustly. And there is a pull request in progress that adds some additional functionality on top of that. So there's some ongoing work. And finally, the idea of thinner controllers is always an attractive one. Right now, our applications controllers are reasonably thin, but some of them are thicker than they should perhaps be. So we might be able to do some refactoring there, clean that up. So code quality, as I said, we're doing much better on test coverage, but there's always room to do more. So we might want to consider devoting some time to that. We use a tool called PHP-MD, which is PHP Mess Detector, which automatically detects complex code, deeply nested loops and classes with 1 million methods in them and so forth. And we have probably about 700 warnings in there about things that we could clean up. So obviously some of those are more critical than others, but if you're a new developer on the project and you're interested in improving something, one place you can go is look at PHPMD, find something complicated, try to make it less complicated. And it might be nice to have goals to try to reach a particular level. As I say, we've got lots of tools looking at our PHP. I wonder if there are more tools we can use to measure our JavaScript quality. We've introduced some new things in the past year to better standardize our code styling in JavaScript, but perhaps there are some other things we could be doing. And finally, one of the nice things about Solar Mark 3, which again you'll hear more about later, is that we now are able to bundle the Java indexing code that SolarMark uses for indexing things into VuFind as part of the VuFind project, instead of the old situation where we were managing some code as part of the SolarMark project, and then we had to synchronize release schedules with them in order to get changes into the main VuFind. Now it's all in one place. And since it's all in one place, we could theoretically start monitoring that code for quality and standards of styling and so forth. So something else we can look into. And as I said, maybe we can get rid of some stuff, because VuFind is huge and has lots of features, and that's great, but it takes time to keep it all working, and maybe we don't need it all. And my two favorites for the chopping block, and please feel free to defend these things if you feel they need defending, are the jQuery mobile theme, which is really old and out of date, and nobody's found the time to update it. And these days, with responsive design as sort of a leading trend, the idea of needing to maintain a completely separate theme only for mobile devices is not where it was when this was introduced. Also, we have a built-in statistics system for tracking user searches and record accesses, which works but doesn't scale well, and I think has caused more harm than good by leading people to use it until it breaks because it doesn't scale well. And VuFind now has robust integration with both Google Analytics and Piwik, which means that you have both a locally hosted and an externally hosted option for tracking stats, both of which are far more well thought out than anything that we could design internally in VuFind as sort of a back burner thing. So I'm sort of inclined to just rip that all out and tell people, use an external service, it will serve you better. But again, feel free to defend these things if you think we need them. But if not, maybe we can clean our slate a little. And finally, the last thing that I'd like to talk about, and I'm very interested in hearing opinions from people about this, is finding an external institutional home for VuFind. The VuFind project, of course, lives at Villanova right now, and I don't say this because Villanova is trying to back away from the project in any way. Villanova remains committed to VuFind, but there are limits to our flexibility having the project housed at a specific institution. We don't offer services, we don't try to market the project, we just keep it running. And right now, a lot of this is the fact that Chris and I are here and are dedicated to the project. If we get abducted by aliens or something, it would be difficult to replace us quickly. Whereas if there were an external entity that was concerned with the future viability of VuFind, I think it would put a broader umbrella over the project and maybe be more easily to encompass all of the institutions who contribute to the project, because there are key players outside of Villanova, around the world. But if hypothetically the project needed new leadership, we're not going to get, say, somebody from Finland to come work at Villanova and take over the project. That's just not going to happen. So there are obviously also disadvantages and challenges to an organizational home. It might impose new requirements on the project. It would probably cost money in some way. So it's not a step that I would want to take hastily or without consulting the community. But basically, what I'm interested in knowing for right now is, if there were an institutional home, what would you like to get out of it? Would you like to have training that you would be willing to pay for your staff? Would you like to have development services? And conversely, if there were an institutional home, what would you potentially be willing to contribute to support the existence of that, because it will likely cost money. So, as I say, this is purely investigational right now, but if it proves to be something that would be beneficial to the community, I want to be sure that the option is out there, and I'd like to know what our resources are and how we could hope to gain from that arrangement. And that gets me through the main presentation, and I think we have about 10 minutes before the next talk is scheduled. So I'm happy to open up to questions about anything and everything. Or you can all stare at me, that's also an option.
I'll comment. I like the idea of thinking about the longevity of the project and how that might help. Being involved with the Folio organization, which is an open source community, and there's the Open Library Foundation, which is starting in the process of getting started and becoming an official 501(c)(3). And I've been pitching to that community that it should kind of look something like the Apache group, where it's a broader organization with many different projects related to it. The GoKB, the Global Open Knowledge Base group, is looking at becoming a part of the OLF, along with Folio, and so I'll throw that out there as that might be a possible option to have the VuFind community be a part of that, a part of that organization. And it's a 501(c)(3), so it can hold money and support an organization. But it's very brand new, so I think it might be possible to have conversations and just see what sort of opportunities there might be.
Yeah,
that might be a great place just to kind of help support longevity and have an independent organization that's looking at multiple library-related open source projects.
Yeah, if you have any contacts on that, that would be great.
Yeah, we'll take up that conversation later. Yeah.
Great,
but
thank
I think it would be
you.
a good conversation to have.
Great.
We're a Voyager site, and we're just starting to look at what's out there with library services platform, be it Alma or WorldShare. Have any sites that you know of been using VuFind?
So the question was, are there any VuFind sites on Alma or WorldShare, sort of the new generation commercial ILSs? And as far as I know, the answer is no, though there has been some development work in both directions. I've done some work with Karen Combs of OCLC, who was here at the summit 2 years ago, initially designed to add VuFind support for their new WorldCat Discovery API, but also included in that work was some initial development of a WorldShare driver. I'm not sure if anyone is using that yet. There hasn't been a lot of movement there, but certainly if there are OCLC customers who want to use VuFind, get in touch with Karen, and there's some work going on there. On the Alma side, it's been an ongoing challenge. A few people have sort of tried to approach that integration and have found that the Alma APIs, as they exist, last I heard, weren't really friendly to VuFind because they required too many calls to get the kind of information that VuFind needs. Like, there wasn't a way of batch looking up statuses for a page full of results. You had to query one record at a time. And I know that it's been said that this is a priority right now to address on the Ex Libris ProQuest side. So I'm hopeful that we'll have a more robust VuFind-friendly API in the future, and at that point I would expect there will be development of an Alma driver, but today there is not. And we're also going to hear about Folio soon, so that's another interesting. Any other questions, or? Well, in that case, I will say thank you. You can, of course, find me later. I'll be making myself as available as I can, and we can start working on Andrew connecting his laptop.